The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
Reasonable people can disagree, even deeply disagree. And such is definitely the case in Kingston, where Queen's University has decided to remove Sir John A. Macdonald's name from its law school. Some alumni are furious, charging political correctness run amok. Others say it's about time, that our first PM's values are out of step with the Canada of today. We'll have that debate here tonight. Then, with the U.S. poised to pick its next president, contrarian P.J. O'Rourke is with us on his desire for an America not of the far right or left, but rather the far middle. It's Monday, November 2nd, and that's next on the agenda. 60 years ago, Queen's University in Kingston decided to honor Canada's first Prime Minister by putting his name on its law school. It made perfect sense since Sir John A. Macdonald got his start as a lawyer in Kingston. But 60 years later, Macdonald's legacy is, shall we say, more complicated, and that's now led the university to the decision to remove Macdonald's name from the law school. It raises a host of questions to explore with our guests, whom we'll introduce, as is our custom here on the agenda, from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital with Jeffrey Simpson, the Senior Fellow at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. In Kingston, Ontario, Mark Walters, the Dean of the Law School at Queen's University. And in our provincial capital, Melanie Newton, Associate Professor of Caribbean and Atlantic World History at the University of Toronto. And I'm pleased to welcome all three of you to the agenda. I think two of you for the first time. Jeffrey Simpson, good to see you again. Dean Walters, just get us started here with some background. What prompted the university to consider taking Sir John A. Macdonald's name off the law school building in the first place?
Sure. I mean, the issue of Macdonald's name has been one that on the agenda, for a few years now. The triggering factor probably was a petition submitted to the Board of Trustees in June asking for the name to be removed, and a consultation process followed, various recommendations made, and these were all put to the Board of Trustees on October 19th, and it made the decision to remove the name. So a consultation process leading to recommendations and a decision.
Let me follow up on that consultation process, because in your report you do point out that you did an online survey, and I'm going to ask our director Sheldon Osmond to bring up those numbers right now, because you asked the question, do you believe that the law school building should continue to be named Sir John A. Macdonald Hall? You surveyed nearly 3,000 people, and yes, keep the name as is came back with 47% support. No, drop the name was at just a touch over 50% support. Then you surveyed law school alumni who answered the survey, yes, keep the name, 44%, no, drop the name, 38%. But of the current law school students, yes, keep the name, only 21%, no, drop the name, 58%. So the question is, how useful, Mark, was all of that information to the university making its ultimate decision?
Right. So, you know, I think we all appreciated going into this that this was a question that would divide people, and it came out as dividing people almost down the middle. Though, as you just noted, law school alumni tended to favor keeping the name. Now, this was an interesting fact in how we understood the responses. It seemed that the graduates up to about the year 2000 tended to favor keeping the name, and then thereafter tended to favor removing the name. So there seemed to be a generational divide here. And then we turned to present students, but also faculty member and staff within the law school. An overwhelming majority tended to want to dename the building. You know, in the end, your question, how do you reach a conclusion on the basis of those numbers? You know, it really wasn't a matter of numbers. It's not just a matter of tallying up votes on one side or the other, but coming to a reasoned decision on the basis of principle. And So that's how we approached it in the end.
Melanie Newton, what's your view of what the university has decided to do?
I think it reflects the changing sentiment about the role that this kind of naming process and monuments and street names play, that it's not changing these names is not quote unquote changing history. It is acknowledging that history in a fuller and richer way, and that the naming, choosing to name something after John A. Macdonald is to choose to constantly reenact the fact that he was such a crucial figure in the history of residential schools.
Jeffrey Simpson, before I get you to weigh in on what you think of the decision, maybe you could just tell us off the top, you do have a rather deep connection to Queen's University, do you not?
I had.
What is it?
Oh gosh, I was a student there. I had a wonderful undergraduate education in history and political science. I was one of the first student senators. I was winner of the Tricolor Award. I have been a fellow there. I've been a distinguished visitor. I was a member of the Board of Trustees. I have an honorary degree from Queen's. I am the permanent president of Art 71, the position I'm trying to resign from, but they won't let me because I was elected. So I've been involved in Queen's for the better part of 50 years in different iterations, and it breaks my heart to see what they've done, because this is what I call presentism. You can use other phrases. Presentism is where you have a certain view of society today and how it should be organized and how it should have values that you agree with. And you project back 100, 150 years and say, why didn't they act then as we would act today? This distorts history completely. Put it another way, Steve, we're having a discussion today, November 2020, we all have worked for or work at certain institutions. We don't spend any time, nor can we spend any time, thinking about what 150 years from now people will think about what we did today. Maybe the next generation, but not 5 or 6 generations from now. It's impossible to know what Canada will be like, what the world will be like 150 years from now. We can only think about our contemporary circumstances, which is exactly what was happening to Sir John A. Macdonald and all the men, and they were men, who were in public life at that time. So to retroactively condemn, and by the way, if you take somebody's name off a building, you're condemning. That's not a neutral act. You're making a strong political statement. You are doing something which I call presentism, which distorts the past. I'm all for adding, and there were compromises available here. But unfortunately, it wasn't quite as simple as the dean has said. The principal of the university very much wanted this to happen and started sending messages to the university community, and I get them, about what I call presentism, quoting Karl Marx and all the buzzwords of today. And by the way, I've served for 15 years on university boards, 6 at Queen's and 9 somewhere else. I have some sense of how university government works. And in those 15 years, Steve, I have never, and I went through my addled memory about this, I have never known a board to stand up and say no to a principal who really wants something.
So the principal wanted this and he got it.
I could see this coming a long time before it actually happened. But the only thing that shocked me in all of this is that at the law school, the professors voted 29-3. That's a 95% vote. That's like a Belarusian election. I mean, you professors, I love them, but they are so hard to work, to herd together. They can barely agree that today is Monday. But in this case, the howling winds of presentism swept through the law school, and the vote was 29-3. Think of the chilling effect that has on whatever students might not have agreed with the mighty 29.
Okay, so I'm guessing, Jeffrey, your colleagues here want to have at that. Mark Walters, can you speak first of all to the issue of presentism? You are making a decision today. Well, okay, you just heard Jeffrey Simpson's argument, so why don't you take a hit at it?
Sure. Yeah. Not surprisingly, I don't see it as presentism at all. Quite the contrary. The decision is made in one sense on the basis of the present values, aspirations, and character of the law school community in the building. There's no question about that. The name the building sends a signal to the world about the kind of community in that building. And the reality is, and it is a present reality, that name was getting in the way of certain basic values and principles that we cherish here. And I'll just name two. One, reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. And two, the value of diversity and inclusion in a university environment. And I'll just be blunt. I had many Indigenous students say to me, and they said to the advisory committee during the consultation process, how can you say that you are welcoming us into your law school to study law when the name on the building is the name of somebody who initiated a policy which had a devastating effect on our communities? And these are students, some of whom will have had parents and grandparents in residential schools and who suffered as a result. Now, it would be presentist to say Macdonald is responsible for everything that occurred in the 80 or 90 years after he initiated the policy. But the fact of the matter is that is how people felt and feel today about the name on the building. And he was indeed the minister responsible for Indian Affairs when the policy was introduced. That's a fact. And I'm not changing history there. I'm not rewriting anything. He was the minister responsible for the policy that proved devastating for Indigenous people in the subsequent history.
All right, let me get Melanie Newton on this part then. If the idea is to improve issues around inclusion and reconciliation, based on your knowledge of when this kind of thing is done in other areas, does it actually move the yardsticks forward on those two issues to remove names, change street names, et cetera, et cetera?
The simple answer is yes. First of all, I think the conversation that we're having now is entirely because people made this demand and the demand was finally heard. In the context of everything that has happened this year in terms of thinking about questions of systemic racism, that's why we're having this conversation. So the conversation itself is productive, and we would not be having it if that demand, which has existed for quite a long time, to change, to rethink these kinds of names, was not out there. So this is an institutional response to a sentiment that is not new. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that on the question, of course, I don't know anything about the specific details of the decision-making process at Queen's, but I would call, if there was that kind of encouragement from the president and a sign of how the president of the university felt that this was something that needed to happen, I would call that leadership. And I would say it is the kind of ethical leadership that does take a position on this question. Of course, it's, and saying that this is what the university thinks ought to happen. So I would see that a little bit differently. And I do think actually it's a sign of the kind of leadership that we would want from our intellectual institutions in the society to say that this is important. And then a last point on this question of the idea that it's presentism. I'm not teaching the same textbooks to my students that, say, someone who was teaching the history of imperialism would have been using 25 years ago. The conversation changes. And that conversation includes what happens in our classrooms. It also includes what happens in our public spaces. So we should not be assuming that it is somehow a bad thing or all the institutions of society will fall if, as a society, we engage in those conversations and look at what aspects of our history do we choose to celebrate in public. Are they adequate for the kinds of conversations that we are having with that past? That is not presentism. History is a conversation between the past and the present. That does not mean that you can change past events, obviously not, but the conversation does change. And it's really important for all of our institutions to have that kind of sophisticated understanding of history. So the idea that somehow a monument once erected must stand forever is like, it's the same as suggesting that, a textbook that someone was using 50 years ago, it was good enough for then, it's good enough for now. It's just not it's not the way, it's not a healthy way to engage with.
But I think Jeffrey Simpson's point was, of course, history changes and we reinterpret it as the years go by. But as opposed to subtraction, what about addition? As opposed to taking Macdonald's name off the school, could you not name something else at the school after somebody, maybe an Indigenous person, who had made a great contribution to Canada as well? Why is that not an option?
I cannot speak to the specifics of the decision at Queen's University, nor would I say that when it comes to these kinds of figures who we come to associate, and I'll speak about the things I know most about, with Indigenous genocide and with slavery, I can't. The response has to be the same. It depends on what kind of public monument or street, or it depends on what you're talking about. So I think the conversation that is happening in sort of heritage circles around these questions is a lot more complicated, and in acknowledgement of the fact that not every public commemoration is the same or has to be dealt with the same way. In the specific case of Queen's University, I do think that everything that the dean just said about how this was being understood by students within the school now is really important. And again, I would stress, to change the name of the law school does not change the role of John A. Macdonald in history.
Well, let me pick up on that if I can, with Jeffrey Simpson, because your great friend and mine, Richard Gwynne, wrote a couple of books about Sir John A. in which he concluded, no Sir John A., no Canada. So that's a pretty good thing to have on your resume. Having said that, Jeffrey, here's what Sir John A. did say back in the day. If you look around the world, you will see that the Aryan races will not wholesomely amalgamate with the Africans or the Asiatics. It is not to be desired that they should come, that we should have a mongrel race. Now, how do you deal with the unacceptability of those views today with the understandable desire to honor a man who created one of the great countries in the history of the world?
There's no question about the fact that Macdonald, like the other white patriarchs at the time, were racist vis-a-vis other than white races. There's no question about that. And they outlawed the potlatch, and they set up residential schools, which they thought, in the way they saw the world, would assist those people in getting an education in the white man's way. There's no question about that. And nobody, to my knowledge, has ever said that that wasn't part of Macdonald's legacy and the legacy of all the people at the time, because nobody objected to residential schools that I'm aware of in the historical record. But when you take a name off the building, what you're doing is you're putting basically all your eggs in one interpretive basket, which is what you just showed on the screen. And you're forgetting about the fact that he and the others actually did something, and we're too modest as Canadians to put this in an international context, but I will, which is quite remarkable. Europe was beset by wars between Protestants and Catholics for centuries. There was the famous 100 Years' War, which was Protestant Catholics, and the French and the English were at each other's throats through much of many hundreds of years. They fought in North America. When Lord Durham came after the rebellions of the 1830s to Canada to investigate what had happened, he found, quote, 2 nations warring in the bosom of a single state. And yet 30 years later, Macdonald and others put together an improbable thing called a federation in Canada with these 2 nations that were warring in the bosom of a single state. Now, let me say 3 quick things about that accomplishment. Number 1, Canada is the world's oldest federation, not born in war and not scarred by a civil war. The Swiss Federation is older, but it was born in a civil war. And we know that the American Federation had a 4.5-year bloodbath that killed more Americans than in all of America's other wars combined. Secondly, federations are fragile. They're tough to operate. My friend Melanie does know more about the Caribbean than I do. She'll know that the West Indies Federation fell apart. Malaysia and Singapore Federation fell apart. Rhodesia and Nyasaland fell apart. The Czech Federation with the Slovaks fell apart. I could go on. So that ours has endured is something of historic international significance. And lastly, the people who put this together had many people in different parts of the country who didn't want it to happen. And Macdonald and those who did prevailed. And here we are, 150 plus years later, with all our faults, recognizing residential schools. There was and there is a compromise. And I'll end by simply saying that in the city of Kingston, there is a big park called Macdonald Park, and there's a statue of Macdonald there. Various voices in Kingston said, tear it down, put it in a garage somewhere. But the mayor, being a sensible man looking for compromise, said, no, he made a huge contribution to Kingston and Canada, perhaps an unparalleled contribution to Canada. So we're keeping the statue, but we're going to put a plaque there that talks about the residential schools. So if the law school was really interested in compromise instead of the howling winds of presentism, they would have kept the name, and they would have had an extensive display in the atrium about the negative things that you just referred to, but compromise, when the winds of presentism blow, goes out the window.
Mark Walters, can I get you to comment on that? Why was a compromise not a possible option here? Why was it only keep the name or drop the name?
Yeah, let me begin just by saying that that Jeffrey's account of the history is pretty accurate. I mean, he's outlined the various accomplishments of Macdonald and Macdonald's generation. So, but he's also acknowledged the facts of Macdonald's policies in relation to Indigenous people and racial and ethnic minorities. So, compromise. Well, it's a bit like the name on a building tends to reinforce a one-dimensional view of the person. It's a celebration, and it's not a really effective method at history or developing a rich and balanced view of history. It was put there in 1960 on the basis of a one-dimensional view of Macdonald. And we could put a little footnote or asterisk beside the name. Please see the plaque inside. Is that going to be effective in the long run? And I would ask, would it be effective to address the concerns of Indigenous students, for example, or members of racial and ethnic minorities, or not? And the answer that we got was no. There are other ways of compromise. We can still have that display case. We can still have plaques inside. In fact, I think we should. It's not our intention to erase or rewrite history. There is a really important history to tell about Macdonald. And I just don't think having the name on the building is the effective way to do it at the moment. There are other ways that we can further a rich and balanced understanding of Macdonald.
Well, let me follow up on that if I can. You ask people basically two options: keep the name, ditch the name. What if there had been a third option, which was, we're going to keep Macdonald's name on the building, but we are going to add, let's say, an Indigenous leader's name as well. So henceforth, it will be called Macdonald fill-in-the-blank Hall. Why was that not offered as an option?
Well, I think, I guess the survey was a yes or no answer, but there was also a comment box, and people could write in comments. And we thought and expected, and in fact, it turned out that many people did offer other ways of dealing with the issue. And it did come back to an assessment in the end about the effectiveness of those alternative methods of addressing the question. And the final conclusion being that if we really are committed to the ideal of reconciliation, it's better to have the name off and the context provided in an alternative method inside the building in some way. The Board of Trustees, by the way, has asked the principal to come back with a plan for public education surrounding Macdonald. So this is something that we are tasked with addressing in some method in the months ahead.
Jeffrey, you want to come back on that?
2 quick points. First of all, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to which the Dean referred before, is repeatedly cited in the report to the Board of Trustees at Queen's as justification for this action. It's ironic that the head of that Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Senator, formerly Judge Murray Sinclair, has said on various occasions he does not favor taking names off buildings and toppling statues because he knows how divisive it can be, and that there are other and better ways of coming to terms with the past. So it's interesting that the chair of the very commission that everybody's referring to justify their actions says don't do things like that. He wasn't referring to Queens, let me be clear. Secondly, you can almost understand why the what I call howling winds of presentism blow in certain elite circles, because after all, the Prime Minister of Canada, his office building was called the Langevin Block. And he took the name Langevin off the building. Who's Langevin? Hector Langevin, when Cartier died, was Macdonald's right-hand man in Quebec. He fought for Canada in Quebec, where there were many people who did not want Quebec to join Canada. He fought for Canada. And he was Minister of Public Works at a time when it was the third most important portfolio in the government after Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. We were a country that needed ports, needed roads, needed schools, residential schools included. And when they scoured the history of old Hector, they came up with 2 paragraphs in which he said racist things against all these other accomplishments. So if the Prime Minister of Canada is engaging in this kind of activity, it's open sesame for Queens. And by the way, if you're going to take Langevin's name off buildings and take Macdonald's name, better take Cartier's name off. Take him off the bridges and the roads, get rid of him. And when you're finished, Macdonald, Cartier, and Langevin and the others at that time, you better move on to Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Better change that name of the university in Ontario, because after all, he didn't do anything about residential schools. Apparently he did nothing good for Canada. And get rid of the names of all of his cabinet ministers that dot the country. There's no end to this once the howling winds start blowing.
Well, I think, Melanie Newton, I need you to speak to that. The fact is, when Laurier came into office, he increased the head tax on Chinese coming into the country, I think by about 10-fold. So if you want to look for a troubled legacy there, you will find it. Can I put Jeffrey Simpson's question to you? If we're going to change the names of things where people in the past might not have stood up to the sensitivities of today, do we have to take basically everybody's name off everything?
So, where to start? So I think it's interesting. What I would say is that the process that Canada is going through is not new. This process of really rethinking the names of these kinds of things associated with white supremacist thought and its defense has happened in many other parts of the world. I do think that here in the Canadian context, there is this, I would say that there does seem to be a sort of a deep emotive attachment to some of these figures, even as people recognize the complexity of their legacy. There was not the same, say, deep emotive attachment to similar kinds of monuments in other places. So I do think that at the center of this, I will say honestly, is a question of race. And that is true. That is a present conversation. But I want to stress that this idea that rethinking whether or not these monuments still have a place in our present life is not about rethinking history. So I would first of all say, so the idea that you would have Sir John A. Macdonald's name and an Indigenous leader's name, I'd be curious to know what Indigenous leader would actually want their name up there with Sir John A. Macdonald. I suspect that would be an extremely short list. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that I understand, obviously, Jeffrey Simpson knows a lot more about Canadian history than I do. It's not my field of expertise, but I do know imperial history, and I do think that what this opens up is also a richer conversation about the context of Canadian federalism, which happened in the same decade and was intimately related to the end of the election of representative assemblies, so the taking away of responsible government from the British Caribbean a generation after emancipation. And they were expressly framed in relation to each other, so that you have responsible government for white settler colonies, you have authoritarian rule directly from the colonial office for colonies where the populations were predominantly white. So this is a long process that goes on. It includes the granting of responsible government to Canada, eventually to South Africa and Australia. It's a longer and more complex history. And I do think that people in this country for a long time were not taught this history. And they were not taught this history because the particular kind of narrative of Canadian Confederation that Sir John A. Macdonald represents was very much celebrated as the basis of state legitimacy. And I do think that in our own contemporary society, the basis of that legitimacy needs to be thought of in some different ways that actually recognize that the country has changed. Again, it does not change the past, but we do not have to maintain in our public commemorations to constantly celebrate the same values of the past. So it's not, I think the idea that it's going to change history or that it's an endless I think that speaks to the deep emotive connection, but it also speaks to in some ways to the fact that this complex history, which I was taught in the Caribbean, is not taught here.
All right, having said that, let me put this to Mark Walters, which is, the fact is, this doesn't end any boil water advisories. It doesn't settle any land claims. It doesn't create any jobs on reserves. It is symbolic. And at the end of the day, I wonder, in your view, how important or relevant this symbolism will be, because you said reconciliation is part of the reason for doing it. How important does it really amount to at the end of the day in terms of reconciliation?
Sure. No, you are absolutely right. In a way, removing a name from the building is a very easy step to take. The sign was actually taken down over the weekend. It's gone. It's done. What have we achieved? I think in the long, you're absolutely right. If we're interested in reconciliation, we have to take the hard, long road of reconciliation. It's a relationship building exercise. Reconciliation is really about building healthy relationships. And that takes a lot of time and effort, and change has to be significant. So I guess what I would suggest is maybe we're at a point now at Queen's in our law school where we can legitimately say to Indigenous law students, come here to study because we're interested in pursuing that path of reconciliation. And not just Indigenous students, we have to get non-Indigenous students on board too, so that they can be leaders of tomorrow in terms of building a better, more just, a healthier relationship between the different peoples in Canada. And I'll just say, back to Macdonald's achievement, I agree with Jeffrey totally. He was able, he and a few others, to unify distinct peoples, French and English, Protestant, Catholic, within a single federation committed to justice and legality. We just want to extend that to other peoples, extend it past the moral horizon that limited his ability to see where the principles of constitutionalism that he embraced lead, and they lead down a path of reconciliation. But it's a long and hard path, and I don't discount the challenges ahead. It's a tough road to take, and you just have to keep at it.
Well, I literally have just a few seconds left to not only thank the three of you for coming on our program tonight, but I'd also like to say that the three of you showed a great deal of courage coming on. We invited numerous other people to join you three in this discussion, and nobody would. So we understand this is a sensitive discussion, and therefore we thank you for your courageousness in coming on to TVO tonight to talk about it. Jeffrey Simpson, Mark Walters, Melanie Newton, thanks so much for a really important and, may I add, very civil discussion tonight on TVO. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
For decades, American political satirist P.J. O'Rourke has stuck his thumb in the eye of the establishment, writing for big circulation magazines such as The Atlantic and Rolling Stone, and in his many books covering topics as broad as cars and politics. But in this astonishing era, where the U.S. has a president as, well, let's say unconventional as they come, what does this libertarian crave? P.J. O'Rourke's new book answers that question. It's called A Cry from the Far Middle: Dispatches from a Divided Land. He is the H.L. Mencken Research Fellow at the Cato Institute, and P.J. O'Rourke joins us now from South Central New Hampshire. P.J., it's great to have you on TVO again. How are you doing?
I'm fine, and I'm glad to be on that channel. I unfortunately can't be in your country. The border is closed.
So I hear.
Yes. Normally this time of year I'm in New Brunswick. I've been going since about 1980 or 81. I've been going every year to New Brunswick to hunt ruffed grouse and woodcock.
Well, we'll do the next best thing we can, which is a chat through cyberspace like this. I have to tell you, I have never experienced an election like the one you folks are currently having, in which more people have said The very fate of the republic is at stake. I hear that a lot. Do you agree with that?
No, not really. I mean, I can understand how people feel that way, but I think I think they're sort of overdoing the public memory is short. I hear a lot of, oh, America has never been so divided. Well, you know, I'm a child of the 1960s. I can recall when we were much more violently and angrily divided than we are now, when the rioting in our cities was much worse, the protesting much more demonstrative, I suppose you might say, the police reaction to it worse even than the police reaction to what's been going on, et cetera. Forget the 1960s. Think back to the 1860s when America had this thing called a Civil War. You know, however divided we may be in the United States, and we are plenty, Fort Sumter is not taking any incoming from Confederate forces at the moment.
No, but it won't look like that. And you and I have both heard a lot of smart people say that you know, if the wrong thing happens, and they can define that however they want, America could descend into civil war, and it won't be the gray versus the blue. It'll be sort of the Michigan militia versus the local police force, that kind of thing. Can you imagine that?
I can imagine it, but I don't foresee it really as turning out quite that. I have been so wrong about the fortunes of Trump, starting with, you know, when he began making noises about the presidency years ago. I've been so consistently wrong about him that I have had my Delphic Oracle license pulled. But nonetheless, I think there's going to be a decisive victory for Biden, and then I think that the vast majority of Trump voters will support that, acquiesce to that. We have America has a rather amazing tradition, even in the most divisive of political presidential races, of accepting the outcome. And I think one of the reasons for that is we're not an intensely political nation. And I think we share this with you, actually. I mean, America and Canada, we're busy countries. People have a lot of individual liberty and a lot of individual responsibility, and that means we've got a lot to do. We don't have that European luxury of sort of madly focusing upon politics, and we both know that when politics have come too much to the fore in our societies, with the Quebec independence movement, for instance, I can remember the terror attacks and so on that went on with that, with the Vietnam War in the United States. None of us have really fond memories in your country or ours of excessively political periods.
Well, having said that, you do describe that the country that you're in right now is mired in, quote, idiot populism and hooligan partisanship. And I guess I want to know, who are the idiots and who are the hooligans?
Yes. Well, they take turns, don't they? You know? I mean, we have plenty of idiocy to go around and plenty of hooliganism to go around. And of course, you know, we do have a sort of violent history as a country. This is where our two nations really are very different. And yes, one always worries, but oh God, yeah, it's a terrible thing. The amount of tribalization that's gone on. Instead of having a good old-fashioned argument about the issues, you know, and there are lots of issues to argue about, and any large democracy is going to have like lots of fights about allocation of resources and emphasis and which laws and which kind of rule of law we're going to have. We take that as a given, but it's degenerated into this sort of kitchen sink fight, you know. I would compare it to anyone who's been in a long-standing relationship of any kind knows this kind of argument. It starts out with a little tiff about re-slip covering the sofa. You know, I mean, should it be tartan plaid? Should it be cabbage roses? And somehow or other, the argument gets a little out of hand after that and gets a little more heated. And pretty soon it's about, you know, how you leave the wet towels on the bed and I drop my socks all over the floor. And from there it goes to that time in 1996 where I was flirting with a girl at a party, and from there it goes to I hate your mother. I've always hated your mother. I've never said it aloud. And America's allowed our natural political arguments, which are a good and healthy thing to have, to degenerate into this kind of fury. I'm assuming we'll get over it. If we don't get over it, you can leave the United off United States.
Well, thankfully, you've given us a prescription forward, or I guess you've given your fellow Americans a prescription forward. And here's a quote from the book which explains it all. We need a political system, you write, that isn't so darn sure of itself. It's time for the rise of the extreme moderate. Power to the far middle. Let's bring the wishy and the washy back together, along with the namby and the pamby and the milk and the toast. The extreme moderate's non-negotiable demand? Negotiation. We won't compromise until we see some compromising. We want political action or inaction. It depends. Now, I can tell you, as a Canadian, I kind of love this sentiment. Are you, by any chance, becoming a little more Canadian?
Yeah, well, I was born right on the border, practically. I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio. Our big radio station was CKLW. We got television. We got Canadian television. What was that wonderful series that you had about the long Canada highway trucker? I remember watching that avidly. It seemed very exciting to be trucking across Canada in those days. This is 1950s or so. So yeah, I suppose I am becoming. And you know, you are a bit of a beacon of light on our North Star in a certain ways, because like us, you are a deeply divided nation. I mean, you have the whole Anglophone, Francophone question, plus a very diverse population in Canada. And you managed to, to my eyes at least, you managed to work it out in a less heated and more civilized fashion.
No, in fact, we just passed the 50th anniversary of only the second time in Canadian history that a politician was murdered because of some political action group. This was the separatist FLQ. So 50,
oh, yes.
It's been 50 years. And I suspect Canadians are kind of proud of the fact that we tend to figure things out without killing each other in the main. You live, on the other hand, in a country that very much likes to divide itself, or as you've described it, between the coastals and the heartlanders. And there doesn't seem to be much of a call between those two groups for compromise and inaction. Are you speaking, therefore, to a vanishingly smaller group of Americans who kind of like the food fight the way it is?
No, well, for the sake of my paycheck, let's hope not. But yes, probably. You know, yeah, I do feel a little lonely out in the middle of the road. You know, sort of out on the double yellow line in the middle of the night with morons passing me on the left at 140 miles an hour, and idiots passing me on the right, and spraying gravel all over the place and flying their big Confederate flag from their pickup truck. So I hope I'm speaking to I hope there are a few people that feel this way out there. We have come to a divide in the United States, and I'm sure it's not completely incomprehensible to you, between a certain sort of coastal elite, mostly on the West Coast and East Coast. They're scattered through our university towns and sort of hip places like Austin, Texas, and so on. They're everywhere, and they're the kind of people. God love them. They're the kind of people who know all about locavore, and they know about GMO free, and they know about vegan, and they know about fair trade, and all of this. But they don't know hay from straw, and this aggravates ordinary Americans living in the physical world who do know hay from straw. And, you know, the results of this divide are bad. I mean, it leaves the coastal elite trying to sip their lattes through a blade of hay, and it leaves the heartland Americans stuffing a scarecrow full of straw and putting it in the White House.
Well, I'm kind of curious as to how you see yourself, because as you point out, you're from Toledo, Ohio, which screams heartland. But on the other hand, you know, you are a New York Times best-selling author, which screams coastal elite. So what do you think you are?
Well, I am a coastal elite who lives on a farm and my chickens can tell you just how bad a farmer I am. And a quick inspection of my vegetable garden will show you that. Yeah, so I don't know. I suppose I do know that if you try to feed the horses straw instead of hay, that you're going to be in a certain amount of trouble. But on the other hand, of course, you're right. You know, I mean, I came east to go to school, and I stayed east, and there I remain. But I don't think that that kind of divide should properly be there. I honestly think, and like I say, I'm not asking everybody to come together in a group hug and sing "Kumbaya." You know, I'm simply asking us to get back to substantive arguments and to get away from this identification and hatred of the other that we seem to be going through right now.
There is plenty of that, and I wonder whether it's exacerbated by the way in which you choose your presidents, namely not through direct election, actually, but through the Electoral College, where you get these anomalies where a George W. Bush gets fewer votes but wins the election, where a Donald Trump gets fewer votes but wins an election. Are you tired of the Electoral College?
Oh, no, not at all. No, I actually think the Electoral College is quite important. We're a very big, diverse in the old-fashioned sense of the world. Very different regions of the United States are very different from each other. Again, any Canadian can understand this comparison. Atlantic Canada is very different from Quebec. Quebec is very different from Manitoba and Saskatchewan, and Columbia, on the West Coast, British Columbia, of course, is much a different thing yet. Your California, I suppose, is that our system, the Electoral College, gives place as well as people a vote. It's interesting to look at the numbers of, if you take the San Francisco metropolitan area, that includes as many people as all Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, and I think Idaho put together. So this little group of people, who can barely find their way through the fog to Berkeley, would be in charge of this vast area were it not for a sort of devolved electoral system that we've had since the creation. And Canadian provinces have a considerable latitude, their own power separate from the Canadian federal government. So I don't think it's that hard to understand, really.
No, we have the same thing actually in the province of Ontario, where we give extra seats to Northern Ontario, which has very few people, but we want to make sure that they have an adequate voice in the Ontario legislature. And New Brunswick, where you spend so much time, has a guarantee in the Constitution that it has a floor of seats it can't go below, even though their population doesn't mandate it. So, yeah, we do get that. But, how many more elections can you have where the person who wins doesn't actually get the most votes before people start saying, this is crazy, this has got to go?
Oh, no, I think the system will endure. When you look at most of the election figures, it turns out nobody got over half. I mean, it usually the case. There are some third parties and some write-ins and so on that keep it from ever. And we're really here. We're talking about we're not talking about two political parties in the sense of like the Nazi Party and the Communist Party or something. I mean, America doesn't have a very firm basis in party politics. I mean, you cannot obviously from some of the people. I'll name no names, but one of them's right in the White House. Obviously, you can't be expelled from an American political party. And if you donate so much as a nickel to either a Democrat or Republican, you find yourself, you're a member of that party forever, whether you'd like to be. You mean you have to change your address and all your contact points to get rid of them. Really what you have in the United States is two broad categories of thought. One category is that government should fix the problem. That's sort of one category of thought. The other category of thought is that government is the problem. And oddly enough, you can hold both of these ideas in your mind at the same time without cognitive dissonance, without driving yourself crazy. All of us have sat in government offices filling out reams of bump in order to get some benefit, to which we're perfectly well entitled and which we should have, and which we're glad that the government provides. But you're sitting there for hours at a time, waiting in line and filling out forms to register your boat trailer. And you can be at that moment, thankful that the trailers are safe and registered, and that we have a motor vehicle department to make sure that no more idiots are on the road. So, and there, usually in the United States, there's a very considerable overlap between these two points of view. Lately, the Venn diagram has been separating, and the 2 points of view haven't had much in common. But that comes and goes in the United States. I'm hoping it'll go.
Well, notwithstanding all of that, your country likes to think of itself, I think, as an exceptional country. And I'm going to read an excerpt of yours, which asks the question, how much longer? Our country, you write, was founded by the delusional and the crazy, populated by the desperate and the unwilling, motivated by most of the 7 deadly sins, and is somehow the richest and most powerful nation on earth ever. Having said all that, I wonder how pessimistic you are about America remaining that.
I'm not. I'm really not. I think that despite all the noise that has been made about immigrants, I suggest in the book, actually, that if you have that sort of opinion about immigrants, why don't you wear it on a sign hanging around your neck? See how you get treated by cab drivers and wait staff and the people who change your bed linens at hotels and so on. In fact, see how you get treated by your own immigrant grandparents if you hate immigrants so much. It's one of the things that's kept America lively and booming. And yes, it is an odd situation. We are a country that was settled basically by the offscourings of first Europe. People, desperate to escape poverty, and also a certain sort of bunch of religious nuts. They were there too. And then, of course, there were a large portion of Americans who were dragged here in slavery, totally against their will. And there's another large portion of Americans who I don't think, my family, for instance, we came here not because of the American dream. We came here because there was nothing to eat in Ireland.
Right.
We came here during the famine, and we actually came across Canada. We came by wagon train across Canada to Michigan to work as lumberjacks. And not only was my family immigrant, but I have a feeling that probably also being illiterate, it was probably about 10 years before they even knew what country they were in.
Well, you do write an imaginary inaugural address for your imaginary ideal president. I've never heard a president say this, but I think it might be neat to hear it one day. And your new president would say, quote, "My job isn't all that important." Are you really sure you want to be an American?
I do well, born and bred in the bone. So what can I do? But no, I actually very proud to be an American. Proud that the weird group of people that wound up here have done such a fine job of making the place, so rich and so free and so powerful, largely for good, not always for good, but no one's perfect. But yeah, no, I would like presidents to sort of stand down a little bit and say, look, this is a free country. I've got 380 million bosses. You are the shareholders. I'm merely management. There are limits to what I can do, and actually, I'm also tasked with doing what you want me to do. Which, of course, is a confusing task because there are a lot of you and you want different things, and it's never going to be perfect for anyone. And I'm not some magical, mythical, sacred king, who performed all the good things in life and society, and who's to blame for all the bad things. That's not how a modern democracy works.
Well, let's finish up in our last minute here by pointing out that in 2016, you did vote for Hillary Clinton for president on the grounds that, quote, she's wrong about absolutely everything, but she's wrong within normal parameters, which is, that's a very amusing vote of confidence here. I do need to know who you're voting for this time and why.
Well, we don't have to tell, we do have a secret ballot, but I'll probably follow the same general thing. It's a little bit hard for me to say, even this close to the election. I voted for Hillary because New Hampshire was a swing state, so it was important in what we were talking about earlier, the electoral college. And I did feel, that Trump worried me, frightened me, continues to do so. So if we remain a swing state, I suppose I'll have to hold my nose and vote for Biden. I saw a wonderfully honest yard sign the other day. I wanted to, if it weren't for the pandemic, I would have rung the doorbell and hugged the people who put it out. It said, "Settle for Biden."
That's a good sign. Well, I think Hillary won last time by 0.4% of the vote. It was real close. Last poll I checked had Biden up by 12. So I think if you go with Biden, you're going to be on much more than the winning side this time. Winning in a breeze.
Well, we'll see. I don't know if there really is a winning side. The winning side may take years to develop. That may be, we may be all losers this time around.
Oh, I hope not. I really hope not. We've had enough of that. Patrick, Jake, it is always good of you to join us on our airwaves. And A Cry from the Far Middle, Dispatches from a Divided Land is your latest. And I'll say the same thing I said to you last time you were on this program, which was many, many years ago. For a smart guy, you're very, very funny. So thanks and keep writing.
Well, you're welcome, and I have but little choice to keep writing.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
And that is the agenda for Monday, November 2nd, 2020. Economic hardship has put many people in need of help and turning to charitable organizations for that assistance. Tomorrow, we'll find out how charities themselves are faring in these times and why they may need some help of their own. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.